Hey guys, my name is Eric Peng and I'm the founder of Daily Fantasy Nerd. In this video, I'm going to show you the key NFL DFS stats and strategies that you need to know. For the most part, I'm going to talk about optimal value strategies, which generally are very useful for cash games and will always be useful for GPPs as well, but they're not necessarily always the best rules to follow if the rest of the DFS crowd is overvaluing certain stats and strategies. So these are all the crucial ingredients that you need to know and very important in cash and can be extremely useful in GPPs. So let's get started. So we'll kick it off by taking a look at the matchup section over here. We have all the games for the week, the times, Vegas odds here, and weather. So Vegas odds, we have the spread here and the team over-unders, or the total points expected to be scored by Vegas for each game. And generally, for high-scoring games is where you want to target offenses and avoid defenses for those games. And inversely, you want to potentially avoid offenses on low-scoring games and potentially target defenses in those games. One thing to note here is that we color code all stats where bright orange is very favorable and dark blue is very unfavorable. And so over here we have the spread. So the spread is really interesting in football, and it's actually quite similar to the spread in basketball in a nuanced way. So when a team is favored by a lot, so let's say the Seahawks here, generally that favors the running game, especially in the second half, because let's say the Seahawks are up by 2 touchdowns at the end of the third quarter. Well, you can probably expect that the offensive coordinator is going to shift more of their play calling to the running game to start running out the clock. Generally, that could mean that if you're trying to play Russell Wilson or the passing game, the wide receivers on the Seahawks, you may be losing a quarter or more of value when playing players in that game. On the inverse side, targeting running backs in games where the team is favored can be a pretty profitable strategy because your guy's going to get a lot more rush attempts, especially towards the end of the game. And so that's a very safe way to get a high floor and a high ceiling. Inverse of that, so let's say you have a team that's going to be behind. So even just the Miami QB, you're talking about a situation where Tannehill is going to be playing from behind, and so they're going to be passing a lot more because they don't want to run the ball. If they run the ball, you're going to run a lot more clock, and so when you're behind, you have to start passing the ball more. And so that creates a little bit more opportunity. Now, you may not want to pick Tannehill in this situation just because they're not expected to score a lot of points. So a good strategy here is to take a look at teams that maybe are scoring a decent number of points, but aren't necessarily favored. And so that way you're getting more guaranteed pass attempts in play. Next we have weather. So weather is interesting. It's not quite as important as it is in baseball, but it is still very important. Generally, you want to think about how weather might impact the game script or how offensive coordinators might call the game. So more specifically, areas that might impact the game are cold temperatures and high winds. In both cases, you may see situations that impact the passing game negatively. So if winds are let's say greater than 10 to 15 miles per hour, so there's some games like Cleveland, Philly here, you can actually click in to see how that changes over time across the game. So there's a few games this week that are over 10 miles per hour, but especially when you get over that 15 mile an hour mark, passers just aren't going to be as accurate. You're not going to be able to throw as many deep balls if you're going against the wind. And if you're playing in FanDuel, your kickers are going to be a lot more inconsistent, a lot less accurate, and you may just get fewer kick attempts for field goals just because the coach will want to go for it more on fourth down. Rain also could be a negative impact. So the Jets game here, there's a little bit of potential rain. And so when there's rain, you have a higher likelihood of fumbling the ball. The ball might be a little bit more slippery for the quarterback. So all of these situations are important to keep an eye on just because they can negatively impact your offensive players. And now on the flip side, anything that's bad for the offense is great for the defense. So if you run across situations where it's really cold or it's extremely windy or it's very wet, those are situations that you might want to take a look at the defense for. So again, like I mentioned, weather isn't as crucial as it is in baseball, but it can be something to keep an eye on. And I'd say you should for sure use it as a tiebreaker. But if there's a situation where you're not quite sure you want to lock in that top tiered QB, running back, or wide receiver, take a look at the weather, and that could kind of veer you in the right direction. All right, so next we're going to take a look at the players table. So we have all the positions listed here, and you can actually filter by different positions. And we're going to take a look first at the quarterback position and walk through these stats. You'll actually be able to click the question mark icon up here in the top right, and it'll give you a detailed breakdown of what each of these categories are. And you can also click on each player's name to get a game log across the last 2 years, as well as some game splits up here. So I'm just going to walk through each of these columns, and all of these columns are sortable. So you can sort by Vegas odds, you can sort by projection, and so this is a very quick and easy way for you to get a lay of the land and what your options are at each position. So the likes here is the Daily Fantasy Nerd community like count, and when you like a player, it'll actually boost that player when you run the optimal lineups. And so we use our lineup optimizer to, given the projections here, who you want to lock in, exclude, it'll spit out the best lineups given those projections. But for our purposes right now, the like count is actually a great way of getting an idea of who the potential chalk plays, or who generally people across the DFS industry like for this week. And so you can see that, for example, for this week, people are really high on Derek Carr and Dak Prescott. Prescott's actually a very strong value play for week one. You could probably expect high ownership for him. So generally, this is a useful stat to get an idea of who people like. It's particularly useful for cash games because they're going to be generally high value players. And it can be useful for GPPs as well, because you can get a brief idea of, hey, how high owned might this player be for GPPs. And if you're not familiar, cash games are generally 50-50s, double ups, head-to-heads, and GPPs are the really large price pool tournaments where maybe only the top 20%, 25% of players cash. You can sort by salary to see who's more expensive, and you can actually see here that salary tends to correlate with the players or the quarterbacks that are in high scoring games. So some of this stuff is priced into the salary. You have the team and the opponent. One thing to note here is players that play at home tend to perform better than they do on the road. So for example, you might want to take a look at Big Ben. You can see that his home split is 11 fantasy points higher than his away split. So clicking into a player's game log is a great way to identify any trends that have happened. We also show you how they've done against the opponent. Usually in week one, you don't have that many division matchups yet, so you don't have as many opposing stats here. I think one example of that would be Eli Manning. Yeah, so he's played Dallas a few times, especially last year. We highlight, in green the matchups against their current opponent, and he's done pretty atrociously against the Cowboys. So, that might be a situation that you want to avoid him. So as we mentioned, Vegas odds is a great way of kind of like a launching point for your DFS research. Vegas spends a lot of time. They have a lot of really smart people. There's a lot of money on the line there, much more than in DFS. So generally these projections on points scored is fairly accurate. Obviously they're not going to be exact, but they're very useful to get a guideline. And so as we discussed before, if, for example, Russell Wilson here is favored by a lot, he may not get as many passing opportunities late in the game. He might actually be an exception to the rule where you try to avoid quarterbacks that are very favored because he gets a lot of rush attempts, but we'll dive into that in a little bit. So you want to take a look at the Vegas odds, the spread, and over here we have the opposing defense, the yards per game allowed, and the DVP, or the defense versus position. And so these are all percentages. It's the percent difference between what the team allows and what the league average allows. And so you can get an idea, like for example, Denver's defense is really good, and so it's very negative. And the Saints defense has not been historically very good. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is that all of these stats right now at the start of the season, so this video, I'm creating it right before week 1, is based off of last season. And so this is kind of taking the last 16 games. So when you're talking about the start of the year, there's potentially, coaching changes, personnel changes. There might have been injuries at the end of last year. So not all of these stats can be directly translated to the start of this season. So we show you these stats at the start of the season because it's better than nothing. But you might want to wait, a few games, 3 games in, 4 games in, before you really start to zone in on these figures. But it's still, generally useful at a high level to see okay, given what happened last year, where's a good starting point? And then you can start throwing in things like, Matthew Stafford and Megatron just retired, how that might negatively impact him. Or let's say a defense got a lot better or a lot worse. So you can layer on kind of your own qualitative research onto these more hard numbers based off of last season. The defense versus position category is the fantasy points allowed by the defense against this position, so against the quarterback position in this case. So you can see Derek Carr against the Saints. The Saints allow basically the most fantasy points out of any defense to the quarterback position, whereas Denver allows the least. And so that's a way of kind of getting a gauge on how strong of a play a certain player is going to be for that week. Next, we have opportunities and efficiency. So one of the most important stats in daily fantasy, regardless of what sport you're playing, is opportunities. So baseball, that's plate appearances. That's why hitting earlier in the batting order is important. For basketball, that's the number of minutes you play, the number of field goal attempts you take. For hockey, that's your time on ice, your shots on goal. For football, the most important thing is opportunities, which is for the quarterback, pass attempts and rush attempts. If you're the running back, your rush attempts and targets. And if you're a wide receiver, the number of targets that you're getting. It's common sense that the more opportunities you get in a game, the more likely you are to score fantasy points. And so these are kind of the base stats that you start with to get to the end result of how many fantasy points you score in any given week. So here we have the last 3 games, last 16 games, the number of pass attempts, and one really important thing here is the red zone opportunities. In football, especially compared to other sports, a lot of your outcome in any given week can be pretty binary depending on whether, especially at the running back and wide receiver positions, whether one of your players gets a touchdown or not. Since a touchdown is 6 points for wide receivers and running backs, or 4 points for quarterbacks, it really is a large percentage of your fantasy point output. And if you're targeting guys that don't really get a lot of red zone attempts, you're putting yourself in a situation where you don't really have a high ceiling, so your margin for error is really small. So red zone opportunities is extremely important. So let's say we sort by red zone opportunities, and you can see, it's not surprising that Aaron Rodgers is at the top here. He's a great passer, throws some awesome corner routes. So generally you want to look at players that have a lot of opportunities here. And then when you take a look at red zone opportunities for rush attempts, especially at the QB position, Cam Newton and Tyrod Taylor are really the kind of exceptions to the rule at the quarterback position. And so one common strategy that you'll hear about in DFS NFL is that stacking quarterbacks and wide receivers is a very smart strategy in GPPs. And that is very true. Now, and the reason for that is because, when a quarterback gets a touchdown, well, someone else is going to score the touchdown as the wide receiver who caught the ball. And so you're getting double the points essentially. So two guys that you might want to reconsider that, or you might actually go without stacking, would be Cam Newton and Tyrod Taylor, because they have the opportunity to score the ball without tag teaming it with one of their wideouts. Over here we have the yards per attempt, or the passing efficiency for a player, and generally these guys will have more upside. In fact, if you sort by the ceiling category, and I'll explain ceiling in a little bit, basically it's the upside that a player has, you'll see that the high passing efficiency players tend to have higher ceilings. And so you'll see more lower values down here, more of the higher values up here. And so you're kind of, first generally you want to look at pass attempts, because if you sort, let's say, by the quarterback floor or their consistency, you're getting a lot of the guys that tend to have higher pass attempt numbers over here. And you'll actually see that players that rush more at the quarterback position have higher floors, just because they are a little bit less game script dependent. So you know how we talked about before how, let's say in the situation of a team being ahead late in the game, well, if your quarterback can run, then you kind of diversify your plays a little bit more so that your guy still has chances to score fantasy points, even if the game script is not necessarily in their favor at the moment. So we also have rushing efficiency here. That's a little bit less important than passing efficiency at the quarterback position for obvious reasons. Over here we have the last 16 and season fantasy points. So these are going into last season, but you'll see that this is a little bit more relevant once we get a few games under our belt for the 2016 season. And this can be a good way of getting a general sense of who's hot lately and who's not. A lot of that could just be a small sample size. So I would be careful to not put too much stock into it. Maybe that player has been playing a really tough defense lately, or a few tough defenses. So you really want to kind of examine why you might think a player's been hot lately or not hot lately. If, for example, a running back or wide receiver is really hot, but it's because they had a lot of opportunities lately, they had a lot of rush attempts, or they had a lot of targets because one of their teammates was injured and they got bumped up in usage, well, that makes a lot of sense in terms of why they might be able to keep that up. But if a player happened to do really well because they happened to get, a couple really long touchdown passes that odds aren't going to happen again, you might not want to be so high on that player. So we have last 16 here. This is a good metric for kind of getting an idea of how that player's been doing, especially before the season numbers come in, which you'll probably want to use more reliably than these two over time. Floor here is we take the season average fantasy points minus one standard deviation. So for the first few games of the season, we're actually basing the floor and ceiling off of the last 16 games. And so a more practical usage of this is that you expect, assuming a normal distribution, you would expect a player to exceed their floor about 85% of the time, and you would expect a player to exceed their ceiling about 15% of the time. So when you're thinking about fantasy point production, we project players here. This is Daily Fantasy Nerds proprietary projections, and this is kind of a median outcome, or where we generally expect a player to be. Now, in any given week, sports can be volatile, and the floor and ceiling figures give us a better idea of is this player a boom or bust play? Do they have a very low floor and a high ceiling? So let's say Andy Dalton here, he has a pretty low floor relative to the rest of these guys, and his ceiling is about the same as a Derek Carr, for example. but you much rather play Derek Carr because he has just a higher floor and he's projected to do better this week. So these are useful stats to look at. Generally, you want to look at floor for cash games and ceiling for GPPs. Just because for cash games, you want to play it safer. You only need to beat like half of your opponents, whereas in the GPP case, you need to beat 80% of your opponents to cash. Or ideally, if you really want to go for the top payouts, you need to beat like 99% of your opponents. So you really need to look for that upside. And going back to our earlier discussion, that's why red zone opportunities are so important, because the guys that have a lot more shots at the end zone are much more likely to score touchdowns, which means they're much more likely to have higher ceilings. So as I mentioned a moment ago, Daily Fantasy Nerd provides you with our proprietary projections here. And these projections are updated throughout the week. So as injury news comes in, as roster changes occur, basically any news that changes, we update these projections for you. And so we highly recommend that you regularly check in throughout the week, and especially right before lineup lock, to make sure that you're getting the latest information possible. One of the most important things you need to do if you want to be a consistent DFS player is to check in for news, right before lineup block. Because if there's, let's say, a last minute injury update, a starting running back gets injured or starting QB is out for some reason, and then their backup is an extremely high value play for that week, and you don't have that player, especially in cash games, you could be in for a lot of trouble. So I highly recommend that you regularly check in. The last column here is the value. This is essentially the bang for buck you get for a player, or essentially your cost efficiency for a player. And so, generally, if you have a higher salary cost, you're going to be able to score more fantasy points. But what you're looking to do when you construct a roster is to put together the highest cost-effective lineup that will produce the most fantasy points combined. And so if you always use top-tier players, well, you're going to run out of salary at other positions. And so this value column is a useful way of getting an idea of who's a really strong value play, who has a high chance of beating their kind of salary equivalent projection. So for example, for week 1, Dak Prescott is a great value play because he got the starting job. Dallas has a decently strong offense. They're expected to score 23 points, and the Giants have a pretty weak defense. And so he's probably going to be a pretty high-owned player. And so you can actually sort by the value column to get a general idea of, okay, who are the cheap value plays on any given week. All right, next we're going to take a look at the running back position. So by default, we have a lot of the same stat categories here as for the quarterback position. The one exception is that we have in the opportunities category, we have rush attempts and we have targets. Rush attempts, obviously the more attempts that you're going to get, the more likely you're going to run for more yards. And especially in DraftKings, where it's a full 1 point PPR or point per reception, whereas FanDuel's half a point per reception, targets is actually really important because for the same reason as QBs that can run, running backs that can catch creates more diversification for your player. And so they become a lot less game script dependent. So remember how we were talking about if a team is favored, so let's say Lamar Miller, late in the game, your team's up by a touchdown or 10 points in the fourth quarter, your guy's more likely to get more rush attempts. But if your team is not favored, and so you're playing from behind, so let's say, let's say like Danny Woodhead here, he's actually a great example for this. Your guy, if you're losing by like a touchdown or 10 points in the fourth quarter, well, you're not going to run the ball as much. But if you're a guy that gets a lot of targets, you're going to get a lot of catches late in the game. you get protected from that downside a lot more, and so generally your floor is going to be a lot better. And so one thing also to keep in mind is that these floor numbers, for example, for David Johnson here, because these stats are based off of the last 16 games, David Johnson didn't really start to get a heavy workload last season until like week 13, when there were some injuries and he got thrusted into that starting role. So before that, he didn't have that many opportunities, and then he became a fantasy beast afterwards. So that's another thing to keep an eye on when you're looking at these stats. It's always really helpful to dig a little bit deeper. These stats are always useful to get a high level picture, but you should always be asking yourself why. Why is, and if you ask yourself, why is David Johnson's floor so low? Well, that's kind of obvious. It's because, once you dig deeper, you'll figure that out. So rush attempts, targets, really important. If you sort by, floor in this case, you'll find that pretty much all the guys with high floors have high rush attempts, and they generally also have a good amount of targets to help balance that. So if we sort by the projections, you can see that generally, again, high Vegas scoring teams tend to be at the top. Against weaker defenses, these are, for the most part, generally favorable. Even, someone like Adrian Peterson, who is one of the top running backs in the league, gets a little bit of a negative bump, just because the defense is a little stronger, that he's not, Minnesota is not expected to score as many points as some of these other teams. And so that's all reflected in the projections. And if you sort by value here, you'll see who are cheap relative to their expected output. And you can also sort by the like column to get an idea of who, other DFS players like. And so it's not a surprise that Murray here is playing on a pretty strong offensive team expected for this week. The opposing defense is weak, and he's getting a decent number of touches. So people really like Murray this week. One thing that you'll notice is, right now there's not too many value plays here. But as the season progresses, and especially at the running back position, there's going to be a lot more injuries. And finding value at the running back position particularly is one of the most important things that you can do once you get to like kind of the midpoint of the season, especially towards the end of the season. Just because as a back gets injured, it just opens a lot more opportunities for their backup to come in and take up those opportunities. And a lot of fantasy point production, or especially the running game, a large part of it is dictated by the strength of the offensive line, even more so than how good an individual running back is. And so, that can make a big difference. David Johnson was a perfect example of that. The starter went down and then he took over, and then he started producing a lot of points at a fairly cheap price. So you can see that his salary here was cheap. His value was extremely strong. And then over time, the DFS sites increased his price as his production became more consistent. So really jumping onto those cheap value plays, latter part of the season is extremely important. And we'll show you that in the projections. And if you sort by the value column here, especially when there are more value plays available, it's a really quick and easy way of identifying value. And oftentimes, if you sort by the like count, you'll find those players really quickly as well. Next, we have the wide receiver position. And for wide receivers, it's pretty much targets is king. There's a reason that, pretty much all of these players at the top in terms of projected fantasy point output have the highest number of targets. When you're talking about, you're getting 8, 7 targets a game, your output's just going to be a lot more unpredictable, because let's say you catch like 5 out of those 7. It's just a lot more volatile. And if you only get 7, let's say, targets a game, but your team's let's say winning in a game in the 4th or 3rd, maybe what you would have gotten an additional 2, 3 targets at the end of the third or fourth, you end up just getting 4 or 5 targets for that week. So if you have a lot more targets, you're just a lot more protected from that downside. Whereas if you get fewer targets, your results are just going to be a lot more volatile. And so that's why you'll find that if you also sort by floor here, pretty much all of the high floor wide receivers have like 10, at least 9 targets. Whereas when you start moving down, you get a lot fewer targets. And it makes also sense that, generally the guys that have more targets will also have a higher ceiling. So for the most part, for both cash and GPP, you want to get guys that have more opportunities. Another thing that's really important is red zone attempts or targets. Just because you don't want a guy that's going to get a lot of targets, but not necessarily be the guy that's going to catch touchdowns. It's the same thing as kind of the running back that could get 80 yards rushing, but then you have someone else come in and jack those touchdowns from you at the goal line. So you really want to make sure that the players that you play are still getting those red zone opportunities, with those opportunities to score touchdowns. So again, if you sort by value, you can get an idea of who are the top value plays. You can sort by like to get an idea of who people like this week. Again, not a coincidence that most of the players that people like have high-powered offenses, expected offenses for the week, have high targets, have weak defenses. So again, these are all kind of the general trends that you should be looking for in any given week. All right. So at the tight end position, you'll find that, whereas the wide receivers had high targets of like 10 to 12, tight ends generally, get fewer than 8 targets per game. And so they're just going to be more volatile than wide receivers and much more volatile than running backs. So if you look at running backs who, the highest rush attempts might be like 20, 15 plus here with targets thrown in. So you're looking at maybe like 20 combined rush attempts or targets for running backs on the high end. For wide receivers, you're looking at maybe 10 to 12. And for tight ends, you're looking at like 6 to 8 or so. And so when you're thinking about roster construction, and we'll talk about how you can utilize the flex position to effectively balance between those risks and rewards, you'll find that running backs are the most consistent just because they have more opportunities, and tight ends are much more volatile because they have fewer opportunities. And so when you're thinking about playing players at the tight end position, generally you want to go cheaper. A lot of the times it could come down to like, do you play Gronk or do you not? Especially if he has a good matchup, just because he's like a really strong red zone target. Jordan Reed could fall in that category, but you see that Gronk's floor is pretty high, and he's just like in a league of his own when you're talking about tight ends. The only reason that he's a little bit lower early on in the season, Brady's out. They're not expected to score as much. Arizona's defense just like kind of average, a little bit better than average. And so there may be better options for week 1 in that regard. But generally you kind of want to go for more value plays at the tight end position as opposed to potentially paying up for running backs or wide receivers. So I want to go into the flex. Flex basically combines, wide receiver, running back, tight end. And you'll find that a lot of the top projected players, pretty much all of these are wide receivers, and then running backs start getting thrown in here. So wide receivers, for the most part, are going to have higher upside. And if you sort by last 16, you'll see that, a lot of these players are wide receivers. And the NFL as a league is shifting more towards the passing game. It's just more efficient. And so that's kind of a trend that you'll see, and this is true for season-long fantasy as well. But what and even if you sort by floor, you'll find that wide receivers tend to have pretty high floors as well, even though the opportunities is a little bit less than the running backs. But what you'll find generally is that running backs will be cheaper per floor point than their wide receiver counterparts. And so it still makes sense to pay up for running backs in cash games. And when you're thinking about GPPs, it really makes sense to look at wide receivers since they'll have more upside. But filtering by this flex position is a good way of trying to compare wide receivers and running backs in any given week, especially when you're looking at, like, let's say, value positions and taking a look at what you want to put there. Now, one thing to keep in mind, especially for DraftKings, they price their players at the tight end position with a wider range. On FanDuel, I think every tight end is priced within $1,000 of each other. Whereas, in DraftKings, there's pretty wide discrepancy. It's like $5,000 difference here. If we actually go to FanDuel, go to tight end. So there's like a $4,000 difference between the bottom cheapest tight end and the more expensive tight end. So generally you'll have more of these value plays at the cheaper tight end positions. Just keep in mind that they're going to be a lot more volatile. They're not really going to have much upside. They're not getting many targets. And getting this amount of fantasy points really relies on, getting a decent upside game. And the number of targets in the red zone aren't that high, for some of these cheaper players. So it could be a play in cash games where you're not looking for too much upside, but you're looking for value. But in GPPs, I'd kind of avoid, playing these players. Finally, we have the defense. So in the defense, we have the Vegas points allowed. This is the expected points allowed by that defense in the spread. So it kind of makes sense. You want to target teams that are expected to give up as few points as possible. And the spread is actually quite important here, because if your defense is expected to give up few points and they're favored by a lot, what usually will happen is you get to the end of the third or the start of the fourth quarter and your team's up by like 2 touchdowns, maybe 3 touchdowns or more. And the only way that your opposing team can catch up is they have to almost exclusively go to the passing game. They can't really run the ball because they're behind by so much. They don't want to run out the clock. And so when your opposing offense is passing the ball a lot, you get into situations where you can get a lot more sacks, you can get a lot more interceptions. And these are much more consistent defensive scoring categories than fumbles or other stat categories. And so you kind of get this snowball effect where if your team's favored by a lot, you get a lot more scoring opportunities for your defense. So generally, Seattle will probably be a pretty good play. That's why they have a really solid floor, because they give up few points every week. Their offense is pretty decent. So there's a lot of situations where a team with a very good defense will be favored by like 7 or 10 points. And so that's why they can oftentimes be pretty strong plays. Over here we have the opposing offensive allowed sacks, fumbles, interceptions allowed, as well as yards per game that the opposing offense generates, the average number of points that the opposing offense scores, which you can kind of compare it to the Vegas points allowed for the week. Just to see, how high-powered of an offense your opponent is. And then the fantasy points allowed by that offense against opposing defenses. So for the most part, you want to focus on kind of the top half of your defensive options. You want to pick the teams that are favored, the teams that are expected to give up few points, and then you can kind of look at where you can fit in certain salaries compared to the rest of your roster. If you sort by floor, you can get a better idea of the defenses that are a little bit more consistent. And if you sort by ceiling, these are probably more aggressive defenses that maybe score more special teams touchdowns. Keep in mind that that is it's a very infrequent event, so it can be a lot more volatile. But certain defenses and defensive coordinators might emphasize that more than others, and so that's why you might see that. Now that you've gotten a better idea of all of the stats down here, we can take a look at building a lineup as an example. So here's an optimal lineup based off of the current projections, and keep in mind these projections will change as news comes in. So again, you don't want to build your lineups too early. You can go in, take a look, research your players, potentially lock or exclude a few players, and then come back in, Saturday night or Sunday morning, and make sure that you check that those same players look good later on, and that there aren't any new value plays that have dropped in or situations that have changed that you might want to affect and change your lineup for. So I want to talk a little bit about some of our lineup construction filters here. One option we have is you can stack QB and wide receivers. So you can say I want to do a 1 wide receiver stack or a 2 wide receiver stack. So let's say we want to do a 1 wide receiver stack. And so you get Des Bryant with Dak Prescott thrown in there. You can also do a 2 wide receiver stack. And so this is a useful feature for GPPs where you want to improve your correlation, which creates more upside. But keep in mind that that creates more volatility because if, let's say, that pair doesn't score a touchdown together, you take a lot bigger hit. And so for cash games, you probably want to avoid stacking QBs and wide receivers. We also have for the flex position for DraftKings, you can specify what position you want to put in there. So right now we have Antonio Brown, who is a wide receiver in the flex spot, which probably is good for GPPs, and probably actually for cash games as well, just because he gets a lot of targets. But let's say we actually wanted to focus on a running back at the flex position for cash games. We could do that. So now you'll see that James White is in the flex spot. And so this is a good way of customizing your lineup creation. Another option here is no offense versus defense. So this is generally true across any daily fantasy sport. You do not want your offensive players to play against your defense, just because it really limits your upside. If your offensive player does well, then your defense is going to do poorly. And even in cash games, it's just typically not worth it to do that, unless it's a small slate. But for football, you generally don't have to worry about that. So let's say I want to play Derek Carr this week. I can actually go in and lock him, and I could do like a 1 wide receiver stack, and then I can see what comes out here. So, and maybe you're like, hey, I don't want to play Tyler Kroft. You can exclude him. Maybe if Julio Jones, you don't like his injury uncertainty, he might be good this week, but if, let's say, someone's doubtful or something, you can exclude them, and then you can build optimals again. So using a tool to help with your DFS lineup creation strategy can really help speed up the process. I highly recommend that you customize the lineup instead of using the default optimal. There's a lot, especially in the beginning of the season, there's a lot of more qualitative news and information that's changed. So layering on your own research, your own thoughts, can really help you create a better lineup. So I hope that this video was informative. I hope you learned something, and if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment in the YouTube page. And if you haven't had a chance to sign up for Daily Fantasy Nerd, you can do so by going to dailyfantasynerd.com and click Get Started Free. Thanks for watching, and good luck.